Chances are that if you're into Total War, you've seen the new trailer for Three Kingdoms' first DLC pack, which is for the War of the Eight Princes. Since I'm desperate for content to put out in addition to my long-term projects that I'm not supposed to tell you about, I figured I'd take up my status as that one guy who actually really knew what he was talking about when it came to Three Kingdoms. Okay, I was one of a couple. Anyway, today we're gonna take a look at the trailer, learn what the Eight Princes War was, and I'll give my personal thoughts about it. So first question is, what was the War of the Eight Princes? Well, in order to understand that, you first sort of need to know how the Three Kingdoms period ended, as the War of the Eight Princes took place a mere 10 years after the Three Kingdoms period officially ended. I will warn you, I am not nearly as well versed in this period as I am with Three Kingdoms, but I feel I know enough that I can at least explain it to those who don't know anything about it. The Three Kingdoms proper started in 220 when Cao Pi, son of Cao Cao, deposed the Han Emperor and declared himself the emperor of the new Wei dynasty. Liu Bei, now based in Yi, a region known historically as Shu, followed suit in 221, surmising he was the true successor to the Han dynasty and became the next Han Emperor. Sort of, but not really. He died shortly after and his son Liu Shan took over. Meanwhile, Sun Quan over in Wu was a bit slow until he finally declared himself the Emperor of Wu in 229. For the next 40 years, the Three Kingdoms were locked in a perpetual stalemate. As soon as one side gained any ground, they would just lose it not soon after. Now, in Wei, there was an important minister in general named Sima Yi. He was very favored by both Cao Cao and Cao Pi. Cao Pi died young due to illness, but he was succeeded by his son Cao Rui, who died even younger. Cao Rui died without any heir besides adopted sons, and this led to several members of the extended Cao family taking the throne over the next couple of years. Anyway, back to Sima Yi. Yi was loyal to Cao Cao and also Cao Pi, and had also been loyal to Cao Rui out of respect for his father. But once the youngin died, he realized he was on a sinking ship, and the only way to stop it was to build a new ship out of the wreckage of the old one. So starting in 249, and then for the next 11 years, Sima Yi and his family would throw a series of coups d'etats while also gaining prestige during campaigns to gain power. Yi passed on his legacy to his first son, Sima Shi, who died prematurely, and he was succeeded by Yi's second son, Sima Zhao. Sima Zhao went so far as to become king of Jin, and he was one of the brains behind destroying Shu in the 260s. Zhao's son, Sima Yan, took over as king of Jin, and then forced the Wei emperor to abdicate to him, forming the Jin dynasty. For the next 20 years, Sima Yan spent his time rebuilding much of the empire he inherited, while also living the life with a massive harem of concubines, while he blissfully watched Wu poop itself from decades of infighting and despotic rulers. In 280, Wu was conquered by Jin, and China was fully unified for the first time in almost 100 years under the Jin dynasty. Sima Yan added another 5,000 concubines to his stockpile and became so busy with getting laid, he forgot how to run his country. It's around this time that some of the Eight Princes started to gain power, and we'll touch on that in just a bit, but first, Sima Yan needs to die. Yan's oldest son, Sima Gui, died young. So naturally, his next son, Sima Zhong, inherited the throne. I don't know what the politically correct term for it is nowadays, but to be honest, if Zhong was alive today, he would have been in special education classes. So it's fair to say that someone like Zhong, who was disabled, couldn't really run a country efficiently. Zhong was also married to an extremely jealous woman named Jia Nanfeng. Jia is the real villain of the War of the Eight Princes. She was a master manipulator who played the various princes of Jin against each other until it inevitably backfired on her. She was an absolutely wicked woman who abused the authority of her disabled husband to push for greater and greater power with zero regard for anything but herself and her own goal of pretty much being emperor in everything but title. This is probably the woman who is narrating the trailer. Now, the term the Eight Princes is a bit of a misnomer in English, as not all of them are what we traditionally consider princes, as in sons of the ruler. Both Sima Long and Sima Lun were sons of Sima Yi, born very late into his life. Essentially, they were the emperor's great-uncles. Sima Zhong was the son of Sima Zhao's second son, Sima You, making him the emperor's cousin. Sima Wei and Sima Ai were both sons of Sima Yan, brothers of Emperor Sima Zhong, and they shared the same mother. Sima Ying was also the son of Sima Yan, though he had a different mother than his two brothers. Sima Yang was the son of Sima Gui, but not the same Sima Gui that was the son of Sima Yan. This Sima Gui was the son of Sima Yi's younger brother, Sima Fu, making Sima Yang a cousin to the emperor. Sima Yue, the last of the princes, was the son of Sima Kui, who was Sima Yi's brother, making him the emperor's second cousin. The War of the Eight Princes was not a single war. It is a period about 15 years long of frequent infighting, followed by periods of peace, followed by infighting, followed by peace, followed by infight. You get what I mean. What happens in a nutshell is that the princes, either of their own volition or after being goaded by the Empress Jia, fought against each other in a series of wars that turned the previously stable Jin dynasty into a total mess. The ultimate victor was Sima Yue, who defeated his last rival Sima Yan in 307. With all the fighting over, surely it would turn back to sunshine and rainbows in the Jin dynasty, especially after Empress Jia was forced to commit suicide in 300. The empire also had a new ruler since Emperor Hui died mysteriously and totally wasn't poisoned by Sima Yue. The new emperor was not Sima Yue, but instead Sima Qi, the youngest brother of Sima Zhong. Unlike a lot of the other Sumas, Qi stayed out of all the civil wars and was a perfectly fair and neutral party to lead after the civil wars. Everything should have been on the up and up. Unfortunately, Jin was so weakened by these wars that they were basically a wounded fish in the ocean, and there were sharks that smelled blood. And boy, did they come looking for dinner. From the northern steppes came the Xiongnu state of Hanzhou. They were joined not by an alliance, but by simultaneous invasions by the Jie, Qiang, Di, and Shanbei barbarian tribes. These barbarian forces quickly overran Jin in a period usually known as the Uprising of the Five Barbarians. Sometimes it's called the Rebellion of the Five Barbarians. Anyway, it lasted from 304 to 316, where the Jin dynasty, as it was previously known, was destroyed. This former Jin dynasty became posthumously referred to as the Western Jin, and the survivors who fled into the south formed what was known as the Eastern Jin. This kicks off another 120 years of war in China called the 16 Kingdoms period, which is a whole other can of worms. So with all the history lessons out of the way, let's actually talk about the DLC. It's one of the first chapter packs for 3 Kingdoms, and it will have its own host of features to make it distinct from the base game, or so it says. I would describe it pretty much like Rise or Fall of the Samurai from Shogun 2 in terms of how it will function, being its own separate campaign with some new mechanics, but it's pretty much just going to be a rehash of the main game, which is what should be expected with a DLC expansion like that. The expansion is going to add a few new units and buildings, but judging by its inexpensive price of only $9, I think it's fair to say not to expect too much, and we're mostly going to just be seeing a rehash and reuse of what's already in the 3 Kingdoms. Granted, it might not seem like there isn't much of a gap between the 2 periods, but just to remind you, Total War 3 Kingdoms starts in 190. This expansion starts in 291. That's 101 years later, so hopefully there might be some aesthetic changes to some models to express the evolution of technology, but I'm gonna guess no. You usually don't see adaptations of the War of the Eight Princes. Unlike 3 Kingdoms, which has been heavily romanticized and celebrated, the War of the Eight Princes has not been. The 3 Kingdoms period is a story of warlords fighting to reunify China after it already fractured, and that ultimately was the end result. Due in large part to its romanticization, the warlords are remembered for fighting just as much for their ideals for how the country should reform, just as much as their own ambitions. And the end result was the rebirth of a new era in Chinese history. The War of the Eight Princes is a rather different story. It's a story of nobility driven by avarice and lust for power that tore a country apart. It is a story marked by terrible people, usually very demonized in Chinese writings, who ruined a country over practically nothing. Furthermore, the direct result of this era was the occupation of China by foreign powers for the first time in history, and that's something that would regularly repeat itself throughout history after this point. In a way, the War of the Eight Princes is not something to be remembered fondly. It is a story of a civilization, still alive today, at its absolute weakest. Personally, as someone with no attachment to it, I don't care. My issues are more with the fact that this DLC for 3 Kingdoms isn't really 3 Kingdoms related at all. I guess you can consider it a sequel, but when CA said chapter pack, I anticipated something more along the lines of alternative starting points in the timeline, slowly adding new features to the main campaign. This DLC and everything it adds, to my understanding, is going to leave the main campaign untouched. And in my opinion, the main game still has a lot of shaping up that needs to happen and desperately needs some things added to it. There is apparently free content coming with the DLC for the main game that hasn't been revealed yet, but I can't help but feel by the nature of the pricing and the fact that none of it will touch the main game that the DLC feels to me like low effort. Hopefully I'm wrong and it ends up being okay. At the end of the day, to be honest, it's not something I'd even be interested in if the price wasn't so low. So maybe that's part of their marketing tactic. So I'm curious to know what some of you guys think about this DLC. I guess my main concern is that I want a DLC for the 3 Kingdoms setting because I feel it wasn't as up to snuff as it should be, and they're giving me something else entirely. I can't help be a little bummed about that.